Hello, welcome to Kitchen Sink Dharma and the very first episode of 2025. And it feels to me like a good time to talk about perfection. And perfection is one of those words that sits right on a knife edge, because it can have positive connotations like when we perfect a skill. And it can suggest excellence or rightness or loveliness even. But it can also take us into the realm of perfectionism, of course. It can take us into the realm of unrealistic expectations, maybe an inability to tolerate anything less than 100%. And it's a word that comes up in the early Buddhist scriptures. They talk about perfection and the idea of perfecting certain qualities. And there's something about that language that troubles me a bit, because it could be understood to mean that we're expected to be perfect, which we're not. We really don't have to be. And we don't have to fall into the trap of perfectionism. And this is where I think it's really helpful to consider how much of a sense of self we're bringing into our practice, how much we're comparing ourselves to others particularly. So if we're trying to build up our sense of self through our spiritual practice, that's going to create an awful lot of unnecessary suffering. If you find that you're putting a lot of thought into how you're seen, or if you're obsessively comparing yourself to others, it might mean that you're bringing quite a lot of ego into this. We're all prone to difficult thoughts. We're all prone to anger or desire or forgetfulness and so on. But when we're busy constructing a sense of self, we just forget that these are just states that arise in us. They're just perfectly natural. We start to believe that we're uniquely deficient. And it becomes another stick with which we can hit ourselves. So whilst we can see the path as including a process of refinement or even perfecting ourselves, it's a good idea to leave our perfectionist tendencies behind if we possibly can, and to try and make sure that we're not obsessing too much about how much we're seen particularly, or how we present ourselves to others. There's a place for dedication, but there's really no need for perfectionism. Basketball coaches teach their students to concentrate on the ball and not the crowd. And I think this is a really good rule. I think it really applies to our practice, just as much as it does to sport. These teachings, the early Buddhist teachings, are simply a system of cultivation and training. And for some of us, the mind thinks that we have to become perfect, or we have to present a perfect face to the world, that we have to do everything right, or there's no point in trying. Of course we don't, and we can't. When we do try and live like that, it's exhausting. So extreme forms of perfectionism, I think, are very easy to recognize, but perfectionism also occurs in much more subtle forms. And I think most of us are prone to it to some extent somewhere in our lives. And the writer Brené Brown talks about how perfectionism is a strategy that we frequently deploy to try and protect ourselves. We use it to ward off blame. So when we feel that we're being judged, we think we can use it as a shield. And to some extent, in some circumstances, it can work. It might work for you, maybe in one domain in your life, like the workplace, because our culture often rewards perfectionism, but it can also become a source of a great deal of suffering when we're relentlessly trying to do everything right, to be above reproach all the time. It can lead to depression and anxiety and paralysis and even addiction. And perfection can go back a long way. So I don't know if you've ever asked yourself, but I think it's worth thinking about what you actually had to do to earn love when you were growing up. How did you learn to please people? And what did it feel like when that failed? And I know what my primary strategy was growing up. It wasn't about fastidiousness or overachieving. I had a bit of a fixation with helping. I actually subsequently built a career on it. And this is not unusual in people in the helping or the caring professions. And I think even now sometimes I question my own intentions, my motivations. Where is this flowing from? I think it's really good to be conscious about this, to know whether we're acting out of an old pattern or trying to project an image. Because for me it started as a response to life being scary. I thought if I could be a good caring person, I'll be safe. And this is not the same as a natural desire to help, just a simple wish for other people to be happy. The two can coexist, but when it's a response to fear or sense of insufficiency, it means we're trying to get something in return. We're trying to earn acceptance or safety or love. Of course it doesn't work. Trying to project a perfect self just doesn't do that. It doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, when our striving fails to protect us against a hostile world, say, we often just try harder. Now, I mentioned the concept of self and how in Buddhist teachings we're encouraged to question the whole idea of the self as to what it is, whether it's something fixed, and to consider whether it's something that we actually need to try and protect, because it isn't. All of this striving for perfection reinforces an identity, a very fragile, brittle sense of self. That's not really who we are. And if we internalize it, if we really take it on, we go from needing to appear to be perfect to actually needing to be perfect. And then we're in real trouble, because perfectionism and obsession with achievement can be actually a very aggressive approach to life. And Philip Moffat writes about self-violence in relation to the harm we do to our bodies and minds. He's talking about how we push our bodies, overschedule our time, how we judge ourselves against other people, and our whole addiction to busyness, how it can take a real toll on our physical and mental well-being. And of course, there's nothing wrong with exerting yourself, especially in the short term, to achieve something. This is about a real long-term disregard of the signs that life is out of balance. So if you ever stretch yourself too much or ignore your needs, maybe not getting enough sleep, something like that, making yourself too available to others, or engaging in excessive self-criticism and so on. If you've ever thought, I just can't let up on myself, because if I let up on myself, I'm being lazy. Or if I stop criticizing myself, I won't just do anything. That's when there might be an issue of perfectionism. If we accept the idea that ignoring our well-being and denying our needs is a form of self-violence, then maybe one task is to practice non-violence towards ourselves, firstly by recognizing what we're doing and understanding that any kind of violence is harmful, including violence towards oneself. Secondly, examining what's behind it. What does the mind think it needs? Maybe thirdly, developing some skills like practicing accepting things as they are a bit more. Maybe learning to tune into ourselves, learning to be aware of what's happening in the body, what's happening in the mind, and just thinking about how to take care of ourselves. Jack Cornfield once said, the point is not to perfect yourself, it is to perfect your love. Let your imperfections be an invitation to care. And I think the Buddhist teachings encourage us to give love and not to obsess too much about whether or not we're going to receive it. And that means we're not trying to create a perfect self or a lovable self. We're not trying to escape from who we are. We're not insulating ourselves from nature, the rawness of life. We're not denying the forces inside us. All we're doing is learning and growing. Carl Jung once said, we don't so much solve our problems as we outgrow them. We add capacities and experiences that eventually make us bigger than the problems. And I think that's absolutely right. I think we'll never transcend our wounding, if you like. The task is to grow big enough to contain it. That means going through the layers of conditioning and unpicking the stories and opening up to your inner life. And this is work that's not for the faint-hearted, because to do this you have to be willing to notice the currents, the tendencies, the habits, when they come into awareness, engaging with them. And that probably doesn't mean you're going to erase them. It's more about knowing them, bringing them into consciousness, accepting them. You might know the Japanese term wabi-sabi, and this is a philosophy or an approach that's based on accepting imperfection, not just accepting it, but actually really appreciating it. So wabi-sabi includes seeing beauty in anything that's imperfect or impermanent or incomplete, and as a way of repairing broken pottery that really highlights the cracks rather than hiding them. And they use lacquer mixed with powdered gold or powdered silver. And of course, in some domains, we can be quite good at letting other people see our flaws, our cracks. We might even highlight them ourselves. But when it comes to the things that we feel most vulnerable about, like rejection or betrayal, or the idea that we might not be lovable just as we are, the ego hides in shame. And these cracks appear and they widen. And we try and deal with that and plaster over them, and then another one appears, and we try to conform to other people's expectations, maybe internalize someone else's voice, or a composite of many other voices. And we try not to let other people see how imperfect we are. And of course, this episode is going out on the 1st of January, and the new year is a time when a lot of people make resolutions and they think about how they want to improve their lives. But the idea of self-improvement is one I think we have to hold lightly, because I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with working on ourselves, quite the contrary, but I do think it's worth pausing and reflecting on why we're doing this. Because life's going to get messy this year, same as it did last year. And rather than saying, how can I improve myself, maybe we can ask ourselves, what supports me to stay open and balanced when life happens? Or maybe even just what's really important to me. Because when I think about the things that I find beautiful, none of them could be described as perfect. Alan Watts once said, did you ever see a cloud that was misshapen? So there's no perfect self, same as there's no perfect cloud or there's no perfect tree or landscape. There is just what is. And that part of us that wants to be liked, because of course it's painful to be rejected by other people. Nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with considering how your behaviour is going to be seen by others. But do you really believe it's possible to perfect your personality? We can train ourselves, we can get to know ourselves, we can explore our inner lives, we can cultivate peace and acceptance, and that's going to help us to live fully, to shed the habits of suffering. But there's not even an ounce of happiness to be had from trying to create a perfect self. So that's what I wanted to say this time, and thank you as always for listening. Hope you can join me next time.